Assalamu alaikum, machwaft hamqavit qdapilkham zajmi.
The end of 2025 was marked by a conference held in the Parliament of the Republic of Lithuania. Within its framework, the Circassian issue was discussed in the context of history and genocide, as well as the current state of Circassian affairs. As a result of the conference, the delegates adopted a resolution and an appeal to the Lithuanian Parliament, requesting that the issue of recognizing the genocide of the Circassian people be considered. Today, I would like to present to your attention the speeches of Circassian scholars that were delivered at this conference. Their presence provides an academic foundation for discussions of the Circassian issue at such events and prevents opponents from marginalizing these initiatives as mere political activism. Among them, it's important to highlight Doctor of Philosophy, Professor Madina Tlostanova, a researcher and theorist in the fields of decolonial studies, philosophy, and cultural theory. Currently, she teaches and conducts research at Linköping University in Sweden, and is the author of numerous scholarly publications dedicated to issues of coloniality, identity, and post-colonial experience, including as they relate to the peoples of the Caucasus. Also among the speakers was Doctor of Philosophy, professor at Tulane University in the United States, Lidiya Zhigunova. Her research focuses on Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet literature and culture, post-colonial theories, issues of identity, and the historical representation of the peoples of the Caucasus. In this episode, we will also feature a presentation by a representative of the Circassian diaspora from Jordan, researcher and publicist Adil Bashkawi. He is the author of the book Circassia, Born to be Free, which is dedicated to the history of Circassia and the Circassian genocide.
Really groundbreaking conference, and for actually having this conversation, it takes a lot of courage, and I fully realize that. And yes, so I was really happy and honored to have this invitation. I will try to be very short because I know that we have a time limit. I would say that one of the main problems in Circassian representation, which has systematically interfered with our visibility and acceptance in the world, is the typical modern colonial archaization as a form of containment and perceiving us as a losing race, if you wish, and hence erasing and devaluation of our experience in the present and a tacit denial of our future. And this futurelessness is something that I would like to address. This trope is conscious, of course, and as usual in the Russian imperial history, it is not original. It is borrowed in the West, in the Western empires of modernity, and particularly in the North American treatment of indigenous people. Therefore, the attitude towards Circassians as dispensable lives inhabiting territories favored or needed, presumably by the empire, the treatment of Circassians as subhumans subject to extermination, expulsion, oblivion has been normalized very early on. Historians have already convincingly demonstrated how the Romanov Empire and later the USSR supported and continued this myth as a justification for their inhumane policies, carrying out ethnic cleansings, genocide, mass deportations, and resettlement of other ethnic groups to the confiscated and depopulated territories of the Northwest Caucasus, and the subsequent nurturing of simply brainwashed local elites or comprador local elites to the empire, local to the empire, or simply bought by it. The cynical Soviet manipulation of history, of culture, of language, of art, of memory was carried out with the aim of emasculating the Circassian sense of self-awareness, human dignity, collective will, responsibility, and resistance to an imposed historical fate. This left us with only pitiful crumbs of theatrical multiculturalism, complete with decorative national dances, decades of national literature or showcase figures of national scholars, as well as the ludicrous status of autonomous republics and territories, which was presented as national independence to the people and as sovereignty, but in reality was a form of recolonization, masquerading itself as decolonization. However, in post-Soviet Russia, even this deceitful tactic gave way to the empire's blatant refusal to allow its colonies to develop economically, intellectually, and especially politically. Loyalty to this resumed Russianness in its imperial form once again became the primary criterion for allowing Circassians to live, to exist, and any attempt to discuss alternative options for preserving and reviving Circassian self-awareness, ethos, political imagination in the present and for the future is now more than ever delegitimized as extremism and practically treason. It's important to note that Circassians themselves were also influenced by the coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of perception, internalizing this modern colonial matrix of archaization of themselves, or ourselves in this case, for the sake of exclusion from modernity and exclusion from the future. Soviet and post-Soviet decades of fear and carefully cultivated mancourtism played a crucial role here, severely impacting the divided Circassians' ability to unite, to engage in collective action, and recognize real problems that, of course, we have a lot. Instead of focusing on the past and various symbolic handouts, such as the revival of national costumes or discussions of the intricacies of Habze. I in no way wish to diminish the importance of preserving and understanding these profound manifestations of national culture, national cosmology, but I do wish to shift people's consciousness more towards the present and towards the future. Until Circassians themselves are willing to imagine and democratically engage in a discussion of our future, including the details of political organization, coexistence with other peoples in the Caucasus and in the wider region, and survival in the face of looming environmental, techno-accelerationist, geopolitical catastrophes that humanity is going to face in the coming decades, unfortunately, little will change. In other words, the discourse of a defeated race of noble warriors must finally give way to the Circassians of late modernity, a thoroughly modern people, educated, active, cosmopolitan, yet capable of double critique, multiple critique of injustice, discrimination, and silencing at various levels, be it a belated quasi-empires in the case of Russia, or some provincial nation state, or the upcoming neoliberal world model that disenfranchises the majority of the planet's population. Due to our extremely diverse and harsh transcultural historical experience of displacement, exile, migration, assimilation, survival, and the outwitting of numerous enemies, as well as our continued access to alternative models to the suicidal tendencies of worlding that exist today, Circassians have some chances of adapting to life in the future, I believe. Circassians have definitely had our own worlding as the art, the wisdom of living in the world, relating to the world, to other people, to other species, existing in harmony and in balance with this world. Moreover, the political forms of this worlding were very different from conventional late modern nation-state imaginary, which is often anachronistically and erroneously imposed on our local history, ignoring the fact that Circassian forms of political ontology, our loose polities with no borders, were different from the normalized modern colonial frames, and therefore interpreted by settler colonists and even the present-day scholars once again as underdeveloped, as lacking sovereignty, and therefore open and waiting for grabs, easy to be manipulated into any forms of unfreedom that were presented as liberation and development. In reality, Circassian complex political system subsequently destroyed by colonization had a lot in common with James Scott's hypothesis of Zumia, a large anarchic highland zone and a specific way of life deliberately avoiding statehood and selecting simplicity and mobility for the sake of better survival, and keeping alternative democratic existence that allowed for certain freedoms that no state could ever promise or provide. Yet, we should not be calling for a simple return to or repetition of past models delegitimized by modernity coloniality. We do not wish to romanticize our indigeneity And we realize that there is a number of political, ethical, ontological principles of Circassian worlding that we could creatively rethink and maybe relearn in the upcoming time of mass migrations, multiple conflicts, and environmental and climatic crisis. I'm not speaking here of reminiscing about past victories and past glory amid the final destruction of culture and nation, but rather of attempts to jointly recognize and discuss other possibilities, so that when the next window of opportunities to change our destiny opens, we don't fall back into the same outdated political models and traps we've already fallen into repeatedly before. To achieve this, it's certainly important to know the history of genocide and make it known internationally, but it's not enough. Moreover, we must be extremely careful.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're running out of time.
Moreover, we must be extremely careful not to adopt the position of static victims, which is advantageous to modernity with its divide and rule principle, but rather to move towards re-existence, becoming agents of our own destiny. We must collectively recognize that we need to rely on ourselves first and foremost, not wait for favors or liberation from anyone. I clearly see this awareness and desperation in the younger generation of Circassian activists, artists, thinkers, who are not infected with colonial submissiveness and fear to the same degree as previous generations. But unfortunately, this younger generation became visible and audible just before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent intensification of censorship. And it's precisely this active group that is today subjected to all kinds of repressions and was forced to leave the Caucasus. But I still think that the future of Circassia is in their hands, in dialogue with multi-million Circassian diaspora. And in the upcoming multi-crisis and reformatting of the world, the task of physical survival, adaptation will come forward, whereas the tenacious local, transversal indigenous forms of being, economic, political, will provide very important paths to re-existence, to refuturing. And here, Circassian experience and ways of worlding will come very handy. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And I was actually very surprised because Gary Kasparov wasn't on the program. And, so it's thank you so much for identifying and putting an end to this awful whatever it was. So I'm going to start my speech. So honorable members of the Seimas, distinguished guests, colleagues, I stand before you today not only as a scholar, but as a Circassian, a member of a people who have endured genocide, forced exile, and 160 years of systematic erasure. I come to speak about a historical crime that has been deliberately forgotten and about the courage of Lithuania in confronting this truth. The people now referred to as Circassians have deep historical roots in the Northwest Caucasus that trace back to antiquity. By the 18th century, when Russian imperial expansion reached their territories, Circassians were one of the largest indigenous peoples of the Northwest Caucasus, inhabiting the Black Sea coastline and central mountainous regions. Speaking varieties of Adil, the Circassian language, and self-identifying as Adil in their native tongue, they were organized into at least 12 closely related communities, each with distinct, though contiguous territories and dialects within the polity known as Circassia. Pre-conquest population estimates ranged from 1.3 to 1.7 million, with major groups including Kabardians, Shapsugh, Abazakh, and so on. This ancient and populous civilization would face near total destruction in the century-long war that followed. On May 21st, 1864, Russian forces declared victory over the last free Circassian territories on the Black Sea coast, bringing in to end the Russo-Circassian or Russo-Caucasian War that started in 1763 and ended in 1864, a 101-year struggle that stands as the longest and one of the bloodiest colonial wars in European history, culminating in the genocide and mass expulsion of the Circassian people from their ancestral homeland in the North Caucasus to the Ottoman Empire. Yet this war and the subsequent genocide have been systematically erased from global consciousness. Historical information is fragmented fragmented, dates are distorted, and Russian imperial and Soviet historiography, through which this narrative entered Western scholarship, reduced the conflict to the Caucasian War with start date 1817 and end date 1864. So this framing not only shortens the war by half a century, but also fundamentally alters its geography and meaning. In Russian historiography, the Caucasian War is framed primarily around the conquest of the northeastern Caucasus, Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia, and the resistance led by Imam Shamil, which is very important, of course, but also this largely marginalizes the Circassian struggle in the northwestern Caucasus. This narrative obscures the fact that the conflict began in Kabarda, eastern Circassia, in 1763 with Russia's violation of the 1739 Belgrade Peace Treaty and the construction of the Mozdok fortress, and that it ended a century later in northwestern Circassia, where Circassians were the last indigenous nation to sustain organized military resistance against the Russian Empire. Such selective retelling distorts chronology and effectively erases Circassians from the war that culminated in their destruction, underscoring how imperial violence continues to shape historical memory. By the mid-19th century, Russian military strategists explicitly advocated genocide. General Dmitry Milutin's 1857 memorandum called for complete destruction and of resisting Circassian populations, while General Rostislav Fadeev declared that Russia must, and I quote, destroy half completely so the other half will lay down their weapons. End of quote. The final battles of the Russo-Circassian War were fought in Sochi, today an international resort, but in the 19th century, the last capital of independent Circassia and the homeland of the Shachi people, from whom the city's name derives. On May 21st, 1864, Russian troops staged a military parade there to mark the conquest of Circassia, while Sochi's port became the primary site from which hundreds of thousands of Circassians were deported to the Ottoman Empire. The scale of destruction was catastrophic. Kabarda's population had already collapsed from approximately 300,000 in 1790 to 30,000 by the 1820s. And between 1858 and 1864, Russian forces implemented scorched earth campaigns that destroyed villages, food supplies, and infrastructure, making return impossible. Approximately 1 million Circassians were forcibly expelled, many dying en route from disease, starvation, and exposure. The northwestern Caucasus became the only region of the Caucasus where an indigenous population was almost entirely removed and replaced by settlers. Cities such as Novorossiysk, Tuapse, Sochi, and Anapa were built atop the ruins of Circassian villages, and monuments to Russian imperial generals responsible for these atrocities still stand today in those places. Novorossiysk itself was founded on the site of Seimas, the original Circassian name of the bay, which was later transformed into a major Russian port, generating wealth for the state through maritime trade and resource extraction, while the Circassian population remains displaced and excluded from its homeland. Today, Circassians are still one of the largest indigenous ethnic groups in Russia's North Caucasus, yet this demographic catastrophe shapes their existence. Approximately 800,000 live in the homeland, divided along Soviet-era administrative lines into 3 republics: Kabardino-Balkaria, where Circassians are known as Kabardins, Karachay-Cherkessia, Cherkess, and the Republic of Adygea as Adyge. So these administrative divisions are imposed, and these ethnonyms are also imposed, and they do not reflect Circassian self-identification. As single people who identify collectively as Circassians, Adyge, and speak Adygabze, but were designed by Soviet nationality policy to fragment the population. This fragmentation creates vastly different demographic realities across the 3 republics, where Circassians hold majority status in only one, fundamentally shaping the possibilities for cultural preservation, language policy, and political mobilization around historical memory. Since the 1990s, Circassian activists in the North Caucasus and the diaspora have advocated for reunification into a single Circassian republic and for the repatriation of diaspora communities to their ancestral homeland. Russian authorities have consistently rejected these demands, maintaining Soviet-era fragmentation alongside policies of linguistic and cultural Russification that endanger Circassian identity. The result is an existential crisis. Circassians remain politically divided, demographically weakened, and culturally marginalized in their historic homeland. Beyond the Free Republics, a small Shapsug Circassian population persists in the Tuapsinsky and Lazarevsky district of Krasnodar Krai along the Black Sea coast, the former heartland of independent Circassia. Despite their continuous presence, Shapsugs are not recognized as an indigenous people in the regional constitution of Krasnodar Krai, underscoring their political marginalization and the broader erasure of Circassian identity. So today, more than 5 million Circassians live in diaspora across Turkey, Jordan, Syria, Europe, and North America, forming the largest stateless indigenous diaspora originating from the Russian Empire, most of them descendants of those forcibly expelled in the 19th century. And Russia continues its systematic oppression. Let me tell you about a recent case that illustrates this. Larisa Tuptsokova, a Circassian writer, educator, and journalist, originally from Adygea and residing in Georgia for 14 years, dedicated her career to preserving the Circassian language, translating Georgian poetry into Circassian, and organizing cultural events at the Circassian Cultural Center in Tbilisi, an institution founded by the Georgian Ministry of Culture. In 2025, she became the target of a political motivated campaign. In August, a fake website purporting to represent the Circassian Cultural Center appeared online, publishing fabricated extremism case against her. In October of this year, Russian security forces raided her parents' home in Adygea, interrogated her relatives, and delivered an indictment notice 2 weeks late. On November 11th, 2025, she was added to Russia's list of terrorists and extremists, effectively criminalizing her for teaching her mother tongue and participating in cultural life. Her crime? Teaching the Circassian language, preserving cultural memory, translating poetry. So, and Larisa is not alone. In May 2025, at least 8 participants in the peaceful May 21st commemoration march in Nalchik were arrested and sentenced to administered detention. Their crime commemorating the genocide without official permission. So this is the reality for Circassian today. They cannot freely visit their homeland. They cannot commemorate their dead. They cannot preserve their language without facing persecution. Russia treats any assertion of Circassian identity as a threat to the state. And now the Lithuanian Seimas, this very parliament, is reviewing a proposal to acknowledge this historical crime. And this matters profoundly to us, to the Circassians, because each recognition establishes historical wrongdoing and frames Russia's annexation of Circassian lands as illegal and violent. It builds an international narrative that Circassians were forcibly displaced and stripped of sovereignty. And each recognition provides moral and legal weight to Circassian claims for justice, repatriation rights, and cultural preservation. And Lithuania knows the cost of Russian imperialism. For decades, your nation endured Soviet occupation, cultural suppression, and the systematic attempt to erase Lithuanian identity. You understand that what it means to have your language banned, your history falsified, your people deported. And by recognizing the Circassian genocide, Lithuania would affirm that imperial violence cannot be forgotten or forgiven simply because time has passed. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for your courage in confronting difficult truths. Thank you. And sorry, I went over time.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real privilege to be with you today, even though screens, the power of ideas and collaboration is just as strong. My name is Adil Bashkawi, and I'm excited to share insights on silencing the Circassian exile. Over the next 10 minutes, I will walk you through facts and accomplished tasks, and my aim is simple, to leave you with your honest impressions. I speak not only of a nation exiled, but of people whose voice Russia has sought to silence across continents, waging a relentless campaign against Circassian identity and the very right to self-determination and independence. For more than a century and a half since the official end of the war, the Circassian nation has carried the burden of exile, its memory scarred by genocide and its identity threatened by Russia's ongoing campaign of erasure. Established facts: Russia's primitive and later advanced colonial methods of control and domination over Circassia ended only with the scattering of Circassians to more than 30 countries worldwide. It's a playbook has always relied on divide and rule tactics and racial discrimination. Ironically, Russians convinced their citizens of a false racial superiority to boost patriotism, even though the targeted peoples were indigenous, inhabiting their homelands for thousands of years without occupying or dominating others. Colonial actions were rooted in absolute domination, excessive nationalism, racism, and discrimination. Settler colonialism, often in conspiracy with other ambitious empires, sought to replace deported indigenous inhabitants, the rightful owners of the land, with mercenary settlers alien to the region. Genocide and forced displacement emptied most of the homeland. The Circassian homeland was divided into Russian colonial administrations, imposing military, cultural, and economic domination. This affected the 10% who remained, many of whom were deported inland far from the Black Sea coast. The stark reality is that Russian imperialism has haunted Circassians since the invasion of Circassia in 1763, after extermination and forced deportation of 90% of native Circassians in 1864. The Circassian diaspora became a global reality that cannot be ignored or denied. Russia's recent colonial wars against Ukraine and a continuation of its extermination campaigns against Circassia and other nations of the North Caucasus in the 18th and 19th centuries. A new campaign began in February and March 2014, immediately after the Sochi Winter Olympic Games. Russia imposed a hybrid war, occupying and annexing the Crimea, followed by southeastern Ukrainian territories. In February 2022, it launched a large-scale war, still ongoing, aimed at occupying and annexing a sovereign, independent United Nations member state. Those who gather with free nations at this blessed conference seek to restore legitimate rights. Such an event conveys the historical trauma of forced deportation and the ongoing attempt to suppress Circassian voices. It demonstrates that Russia's efforts are not confined to the Caucasus, but extend regionally and internationally, making the issue urgent and far-reaching. Circassian rights encompass both cultural erasure and political denial. Holding this event elevates the issue beyond local politics, framing it as an international struggle for recognition and justice. Genocide recognition. Today, as a member of the Circassian nation, I find myself speechless, unable to fully express my overwhelming feelings. Words cannot convey my gratitude to the Lithuanian people for this rare opportunity to hold conference on the Circassian genocide and its repercussions in the Lithuanian Parliament. I am certain that the results of this conference will be positive, known to both friend and foe, and will lead to recognition of Circassian rights as well as acknowledgement of the genocide. It is in the best interest of Circassians to highlight both political rights and cultural survival. Broadening the scope of recognition, the Circassian nation demands the Russian recognition for the genocide, to apologize, provide appropriate compensation, allow the right of return under international protection, and restore the right to self-determination and independence. In this context, I note the achievements of the Circassian campaign to raise awareness and gain recognition. Georgia on May 20, 2011, and Ukraine on January 9, 2025, our neighbors from the East and West recognized the Circassian genocide and its ongoing consequences perpetrated by Russia. In May 2012, Georgia inaugurated a memorial in Anaklia on the Black Sea to honor the victims of genocide and forced displacement. Let this gathering stand as a testament that the Circassian voice cannot be silenced, nor its history erased. By recognizing the Circassian genocide and affirming the right to identity and independence, we honor the resilience of a nation exiled and affirm our shared commitment to justice, dignity, and freedom for all oppressed peoples. Let us unite in demanding recognition, justice, and the restoration of Circassian rights and independence. Let us lift our voices together so that the exile is no longer silenced and the Circassian nation may rise again to dignity, memory, and freedom. Exile may silence voices, but it cannot extinguish a nation's memory or its right to freedom. Thank you for listening, and the written version of this speech will be published online this evening.
ويتلف خزم يكبزر ويبسم تغش سعد الوجز وتكون يحب سرتاق وابن خججات